Hello, everybody. Um, Thank you for watching this video of mine. Hopefully that I give you some great insight as to the topic that's going to be covered, which is community cultural wealth. Um, I'm really happy to be a part of this team, and I really enjoy having the opportunity to share my knowledge and insight with you all, and also my experience. So, my name is Gabino Noriega, and I am from the University of New Mexico. Go Lobos! Um, and um, One thing that's pretty cool about the area that I'm at is I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so in the Southwest region of the United States. Um, and We're in a pretty interesting area, being that we are a border state. So we have a lot of individuals who are immigrants and migrants to the United States from Mexico, Guatemala, places like that. Um, and we are an area with a high population of minority students. And I'll talk more about that as we're going along. But first, I wanted to like kind of chat a little bit about where I'm from and stuff like that, and the university. I know you all are potential teachers, and you guys are getting into the mode of being a part of the classroom community, being a part of your school community, and being a part of the community that you're in, and you're serving as an educator or a leader. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that before we dive into community cultural wealth. And I always joke around with other with my, because I teach a seminar for student teachers for secondary ed social studies for University of New Mexico. Um, and I forgot to mention I'm a PhD candidate too, so I'm working on a dissertation now, and it's awesome. It's a great endeavor, and it was a wonderful way of learning more about the communities I serve, but also pushing forward with new ideas and theories and stuff like that. That's going to hopefully make education a better place for all students. But like I said, um, one thing about it that's kind of interesting is that I do teach the seminar, so I know um, kind of being in the same shoes as your professors too, and also with you. Like I'm an educator as well, so I teach at a high school and at the university. Um, and so I am in the same shoes as many of you are. I've been in your shoes before as a student teacher and stuff like that too. So, and as a CT, so as a cooperating teacher, like I've been there as well. And so with my seminar students and my student teachers that I've had in the past, I always push that idea that, yeah, you're a teacher, but you're also so many other things. All right. To some people, you're a leader in your community. To some individuals, you're the other person that's raising their child. Another to some of your students, sometimes you're not just their teacher, you're like an aunt or uncle or tío or tía, or you're a brother or sister. It's like it's always more than just being a teacher. Sometimes you're the only person that offers them any kind of positive um you know critiques or even anything like that, any kind of advice. I mean, you're a number of things, and so as a teacher we just have to recognize that first and foremost. And one way of doing that too is by understanding individuals situations and understanding their lives, because that's a big part of being an educator too, is that we run into so many things that are outside of the classroom that cause um, various reactions in the classroom, various things that students do in the classroom that most people wouldn't understand unless like you really took the time to do so. And I always tell people like that's one of the most important things you could do as an educator is take the time. Now that doesn't mean like you have to give up everything, and I always tell people don't do that either. You have to find that like happy medium, but a big part of it is like understanding that um you as an educator have to do that. You have to be understanding, and you have to be you have to listen to the stories of our students, and their families sometimes, and the community that we're in. And so, and the community they're in too. And that leads us to what we're going to be discussing today, and that's community cultural wealth. And I know that sorry, bells ringing. That theory gets thrown out quite a bit, and people are always you know, taught certain perspectives of it, or taught parts of it, whether it's like, oh, I read this article about community cultural wealth. Um, but one thing to recognize is that a lot of the stuff in there pertains to, and this is one thing that I know my students have said in the past, is like, um, well, yeah, it's, I get it, but like, I don't know how it applies to my classroom. It doesn't matter, honestly, um, what kind of classroom you're in, what environment you're in, what community you're serving. It applies. And I'm going to talk about that too, in a little bit, because I think it's important to discuss that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick so you all can see this slideshow I created. Um, make myself a little bigger. Hi, there's me. All right. So community cultural wealth. Um, First and foremost, this theory is something that has, was started years ago, and now it's like coming to the forefront, just like any other kind of research. But one thing about it that's interesting is that it took the historical events of the past and social political and all that kind of stuff, and it put it to the forefront, to where we are analyzing, and we are reviewing, and we are revamping and reforming things based off of this. But one thing to recognize too is that sometimes we run into these scenarios where community cultural wealth is kind of disregarded and stuff like that, just like we see with other types of theories and stuff like that. But one thing I want to make clear is that, community cultural wealth comes from a framework that focuses on the fact that there are certain cultural attributes and certain cultural pieces of wealth that are significant. And when I say significant, I mean that they are a big part of people's success. Okay. And so one thing that I think is interesting about this too is that, like, um, there's so much talk about certain theories, like one big one now is like critical race theory. Like, oh no, like everyone's like freaked out to talk about critical race theory. But critical race theory, or CRT, um, was something that was needed, because what happens is we see all of these historical events in the past that talk about um big changes in education and educational reforms and all this stuff. And things have been positive, and things have also been negative in a way, and I'm going to explain myself when I say that. But critical race theory looks at um deconstructing those things and finding out the root of some of these things by having a critique on things that we're doing in the classroom, being critical about certain things based off of race and things like that. Obviously, I mean, that's in the name, right? And so one thing that's kind of interesting about that is when we talk about socio-political past and stuff like that, there's some narratives obviously that are left out. And so we hear about certain events that have happened and things that have occurred and changes that were made, um and it's been a positive, but within that we're still seeing negative elements, like you talk about um the desegregation of schools during the civil rights movement and stuff like that. And it's a beautiful thing that we get that, but at the same time we're still seeing the aftermath of that. We're still witnessing um segregation of schools based off of economics rather than like race or whatever you want to say. You know what I mean? You can go to any local school district and you could be like, yo, this is the rich school and this is the poor school. This is the rich part of town or the affluent part of town. This is the lower SES part of town. This is the middle class area. Like, that's still a thing. And we can see that separation based off of that, even, right? And a lot of it is economic now. And it's still like, I'm not gonna say that it's not about race and stuff like that, but it still is, and it's still something that's being or with that we're having to deal with even today. And we talk about different things in the past in regard to like educational reform and stuff like that. And we see that although things have changed, and maybe, some of the stuff has dissipated or gone away, or so we think there's also these elements that are still there. So like educational reform has been something that's always been uh, um an area where people were really trying to like make a difference and trying to say this stuff and do these things. And then this has been happening for years. You know what I mean? Like Nation at Risk, Goals 2000, No Child Left Behind, all of these um areas where they're talking about, and policies and things like that, where they're talking about offering educational reform and things like that. um but we still see um, groups of students still struggling. We still see um, uh, students who do not have access and resources that are required to be successful in their schooling. And so we still see that subtractive schooling, if you will. I don't know if you guys read that yet. Um, but at the same time, um, there's people that are being critical about that, people that are pushing that. And so individuals like Tarayoso, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who was the one that coined the term and came up with the theory of community cultural wealth, um, is looking at that stuff. They're reviewing those things. They're doing analysis, and they're being critical of some of this stuff. And so one thing that's important about it is that they're understanding that there's certain elements within educational reform and the history of education too, where and even the communities that they serve, where we're seeing that they have um, continued to fail students in many ways and fail the communities that they serve. And it's not necessarily even school's fault. Obviously, like teachers, like we get blamed for all kinds of stuff all the time, right? But in reality, it's not that. It's just that sometimes we don't have the access, sometimes we don't have the resources, sometimes we don't have funding, sometimes we don't have this and that. I mean, there's so many things, but they bring up all this thing in these policies where it's supposed to be focused on that. So like example is like standardized testing. Okay. For years and years and years, um, politicians and individuals who are pushing this kind of legislation and policy are saying, yeah, we're not supposed to like, yeah, we have these problems with student achievement, dropout rates. We have all this negative stuff that's happening. And we see that students learn better in these kind of environments. Like you talk about project-based learning. We talk about culturally sustaining, culturally affirming, and culturally responsive educational environments being pushed in policy, but then it's never implemented. Like how do we're still using standardized testing to this day, whenever they've been saying like, oh, we need to drift away from that, but it's still there, right? And so these critiques end up being pushed by theorists like and scholars like and researchers like Tara Yoso, who are trying to figure out like, yeah, there's that stuff, and we're trying to deal with that, but there's these other ways that we can help our students. For instance, here for us, like we're it's the population of our students in the district that I'm in and in New Mexico is predominantly Hispanic. So you're talking like anywhere between some districts are 85% Hispanic and some of them are like 74. The district that I'm in, we're 76% Hispanic, all right, population. And the population in New Mexico is higher than that. Around the same, it's like 78 or something like that, in the district that we're in. Okay. So one thing that's kind of interesting about it is that they talk about a lot of things, and this is like part of the dissertation that I'm working on too, is discussing this with Latino students or Chicano students, right? Or Hispanic students. And the thing about it is like the dropout rate for these students is very high compared to other groups, right? um but there's nothing being done really about that. There's no way that they're like really pushing that those policies to make those changes. They see our students aren't learning that way, and there's not much that they're trying to do to change it. And so that's why it's important to know this stuff, because this is how we can utilize our class time to be able to do this. And so let's talk about that real quick. So let me the other thing too is I want to really focus on the fact that um in education now, we always see things from a deficit perspective. And so it's always like this negative, right? It's always like dropout rates, da, 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 which even like I'm talking about, right? But the fact is that there's positives too. And so one thing to recognize with our students is that, you know, sometimes uh those negatives are what draw them down. So they're even already they go into it automatically thinking like I'm gonna fail. This says this says that. Oh, um the standardized testing that was done in our school district says that all of us are terrible at reading and terrible at math. You know what I mean? And then so when you're hearing that deficit perspective, that's how you think. Like that's where we push them, right? That's where they're pushed to go, is they go there automatically from a deficit perspective. So they already think that they're going to fail. And so the idea is to get them to feel that they're not. In order to do that, sometimes we have to have them understand what they bring to the picture, what they bring to our classroom, what they bring to our lives, what they bring to our community. And so that's what's beautiful about community cultural wealth. And so let's talk about it. So first off, I want to say, like, what is wealth? Like, a lot of people always think wealth is economic. And so they automatically attach it to this idea of money. And that's because, like, global society has done that to us. So we have the idea that wealth is always money. And so sometimes we think about it as like our checking account, our savings account, an inheritance that we have, our equity in our homes. Like, those are all the pieces of wealth that typically we think of as this monetary wealth. And all those things are important too, but there's also parts of there's also examples of wealth that aren't just about money. Like, it's not always just about money. Like, I have this thing in here. I usually ask y'all like in person, like, oh, what's this? What are some other examples of wealth? And everyone's like, health, because they could see it on there. So your health is part of your wealth too, right? So being healthy, being able to access things based off of your health. And so when you take care of yourself, that's obviously a positive thing. People bring up family too. Like, family is a huge part of your wealth. There's so many examples of how family can provide us with not only like monetary wealth, which happens, right? Like with inheritances, or your family supporting you in certain things, or helping you out when you need help. But it's also that idea of like love too, right? So like you acquiring family wealth through love is also a part of it. So we also see that form of wealth as well. And like sometimes you hear people call them capital, right? So we have different forms of capital and wealth based off of this. And then happiness too. So sometimes, we can be, and it's funny, like, you always hear people say like, oh, money can't buy happiness. And some people are like, yes, it can, and so see, like, you can go on these trips and stuff like that. And in reality, like, I always joke around, and I try to bring like my own experience in here. Like, I grew up in a family that we didn't have a lot. We kind of struggled sometimes, and uh and sometimes it was difficult for us to like even have dinner on the table, and stuff like that, where my parents had to struggle. Um and that was kind of an interesting thing too. But I can never say that I didn't have that. I could never say that I didn't have the wealth of family and love and happiness, because my parents did whatever they could to do that, provide us with that. And same thing with me. Like, I remember my mom told me like, yeah, you can go spend all this money on all these things, right? But the biggest thing that you can provide your child with is beautiful memories. And I took that to heart, and I like totally do that now. I'm a father of two, and like that's my thing, is like me and my wife are like, let's just give them these memories that they'll never forget, and it's not always about like, oh, we go over here. Like, some of my best times I've had with my kids is going to local lake and taking and swimming there for free. You know what I mean? And like they always talk about it. And so it's these little things, right? And so wealth is not just monetary, it is all this other stuff. And all these other examples that we're going to be covering now in a minute. But one thing that I want to get clear is that it's important to discuss that idea of wealth, not only just being a part of money, but it's also part of our experience. And that's like one of the things that we can take away the most is like knowledge and love and family and experience are the most important forms of wealth that we can acquire. Those are the most important forms of wealth that we can attain during this time. And the thing that's special about it is that we can get those pieces of wealth, um, like I said, like knowledge or love or whatever, and we can use it again. Like it doesn't run out like money does. Okay, so that's one thing that's kind of nice. So let's move forward a little bit. Let's talk about YOSO and community cultural wealth. So basically what this model does is it examines these various forms, these six various forms of culture, capital, and originally it's based off of students of color's experience within college, um, from an appreciative standpoint instead of this other view where we're seeing, and even from like a deficit view. So it's like we're taking away that idea of like, oh, you guys don't have this, and we're saying, no, you guys have this, right? And so we're going to talk about that. And these are the different examples of it, right? So we have our different tenants or forms of community cultural wealth. And so we have like aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, social, navigational, and resistance capital. And so what Yoso does is she goes and explores these ideas of like strengths and experiences and narratives even that students of color bring with them to the environment that they're in. And so that could be in here. In this case, it was college, and then now we've gone into like different forms of community cultural wealth and different levels of schooling and stuff like that as well. But one thing that's kind of interesting about it is like this model acknowledges that cultures um of students of color nurture and empower them, right? They're and that even involves them being successful academically, um and in their careers and things like that. And so it's kind of nice to take that perspective and then implement it into schooling. Okay. And so one thing about Yoso too is that you know there's these assumptions that people have based on the communities they serve and based on the students that they serve, um like we see from deficit perspective, for educators too, right? We hear these things and we go in our classrooms thinking that all these kids are not going to do well because they come from this community and stuff like that, right? Well, she states that it's important for educators to understand that every one of those students brings something special to the classroom, and it might not be what you think, and so that's what's kind of awesome about it is we see them do this, and we see that educators can take that and use it to help other individuals to learn certain topics or to connect some way with something. I mean, there's a number of ways we can use it. I'm going to talk about that too in a little bit. um but basically the idea is that community cultural wealth can provide um, our school communities and our students and even us as educators with tools to help students to continue to be successful and to see where they fit in to the world instead of having this like deficit perspective all the time and this disconnect from the societies that we live in and the communities that we live in. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Um, so the definition of community cultural wealth is this: it's an array of cultural knowledge, skills, abilities, contacts possessed and utilized by socially marginalized groups as both a form of survival and resistance to large and small forms of oppression. So all of us face forms of oppression. Doesn't matter what where we come from, what communities we're in, what ethnicity we are, social status, any of this stuff. There, we all kind of face forms of oppression in different ways, and intersectionality states that as well, where we see where Kimberly Crenshaw talks about I always tell people like the way our identities work. I'm sorry, I'm like I jump a lot around all over a little bit. Um, but our identities are like spaghetti. So it's not like when we see a plate of spaghetti, it's not like noodles just like this, right? Like, oh, they're just laying across. It's like noodles on the plate, splattered on, and they're all intersecting, right? Each one of those noodles makes up a part of our identity, and they intersect. And so some of them have positive, some of them have negative things with them, right? Or connotations. You might want to think about it like that. Um, but all of us face forms of oppression in some way. And so community cultural wealth says, hey, although we do have these small forms of oppression and larger forms of oppression, these are how we can utilize our cultural knowledge and our cultural wealth to address these. For instance, so skills. So this is a kind of interesting one too. And so it goes along with like linguistic capital. All right. So, or English linguistic wealth, if you want to call it that. So linguistic wealth talks about language, right? It's about how people can access and use language as a kind of capital. And so it could be it could be because of social, it could be because of academic, it can be anything like that, but it's how you use language to maneuver in the environments that you're in. Let's talk about bilingualism. All right. So um I grew up in a community where most of us were English language learners or ELL students. Back in my day, it was ESL. And so when I got into school, we spoke English and Spanish at home. So um when I went into school, they put that on my registration and stuff like that. So they were like ESL and threw me in ESL. My name's Gabino Noriega too, so that didn't help. Uh, and so they stuck me in there, and it was cool because I knew a lot of the language, but I also didn't know some of it because, like I said, we spoke English and Spanish at home. So it was like, by no means was I fluent in either one by the time I was a 5. You know what I mean? And so we're talking about math skills and things like that where I didn't learn it that way, and so it ended up uh, being difficult to grasp some of the concept based off of that. But one thing that was awesome was that like when the teachers uh had a question for some of the parents of students that I were in class with, and they didn't know how to say it, they couldn't say it in English, or they didn't understand, there I was translating when I was 5. And we see a lot of our students do that, right? How many of our students go to our student-led conferences or anything like that? I don't know, here it's like it's way more frequent here than other places. But we go to our student conferences, or we have to call a parent and the parent doesn't speak English, and who's over there translating for us? Our students, right? And so one thing that's really interesting about that is there's always this like still this deficit perspective where students are like, oh yeah, I do it, but like it's frowned upon. And I think about like my father growing up and my mother when they got into school, both of them didn't speak English at all, and like this is like in the 40s and 50s, right, where they would get hit and stuff like that if they spoke Spanish or native tongue, right? And like that was something that was also embedded and ingrained in our minds too. So I remember being a little kid, I'm like, oh, I don't know. And our students are still chastised for it even. And that's kind of a bad thing. But in the whole scheme of it, that's a very important skill and ability to have, right? So that linguistic capital that student walks in there with, because what happens when they join the workforce and they're working in their career, being uh a student that can speak sorry, bug, uh being a student that can speak multiple languages, or being a person that can speak, that is bilingual, is a great skill to have, right? Like for instance, my wife works in the medical field, and she has individuals that will go and translate for them, and it's you know a big deal because there's so many instances where they need that. And so that person is sought after, like that's a part of the the job duties, right? Is to be able to translate and speak multiple languages. So that's a beautiful skill to have, and it comes in handy a lot, right? So that's an example of that. The other one is contacts. I'm going to talk about this and share a personal story too. So my father was one of those people that always had a guy. I don't know if you guys know those people like, oh, like, oh, but they weren't called guys, they were called hermanos. And so, or like brother, right? And so like I'd be like, yo, dad, my car, it sounds weird. It's making a terrible sound. And my dad would be like, yo, let's call Hermano Ruben, who was a mechanic. And so they call him, my dad would line stuff up, and then I'd take my car over there and Hermano Ruben would fix it. Oh, my there's something wrong with my plumbing. Oh, let's call Hermano Esteban, and he'd come fix whatever was wrong with your plumbing. So he had people for everything, those contacts. And then so what ended up happening is like when my dad passed away a couple years ago, um, who still had those contacts? Yo, me. And so now I'm the one that's doing that, right? And the thing that's cool about it is now, but now like Hermano Ruben doesn't work on cars anymore. It's his son Brian. And so Hermano Brian is the one that fixes cars now. And so like now whenever like my familia needs something like that, they're like, can you call Hermano Brian for me? And I'll be, yeah, I'll set you up, and I'll give you their number and stuff like that. And so those contacts end up being a big part of us being able to uh have this opportunity to help each other out and to get things done. And sometimes, and those are examples of like everyday things, right? But it can apply to school too. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. But the fact of the matter is it's important to kind of recognize that. Um, and those lie in different very, and the other thing too is like I want to talk about this next is here's this, you guys might have seen this graphic here of community cultural wealth, and it shows here like what all of them are. The other thing too that I want to kind of express is that these forms of capital intersect as well. So there's times whenever we have like for instance the one with my dad, right? So it's familial capital because my dad is the one that's sharing that contact. He's the one that's has the knowledge or the capital there that's now he's sharing it with me, but it's also about navigational too, right? And so he's showing me how to navigate that system, how to navigate like, oh, this is how I get my car fixed, right? And so there's great examples of that. Let me give you another one. All right. So this is some examples that we can talk about for our students and to apply it to our classroom. And so all of these can apply to situations that you're talking with your students. And I usually do it when I'm first um, meeting with them and stuff like that, and learning about their lives. And I'm huge on student rapport, so like I'm one of those people that like I ask my students questions like not just about class, but like, oh, do you guys work? And oh, where are you working at? Oh, do you do sports? I try to make this contact with them, and I try to connect with them personally too, um so that we develop a respect for each other, right? So I respect their life and they respect mine. And so and part of it is knowing each other. And so my students like are really cool about that. And so like I always push for that idea of like establishing strong rapport with my students. And one of the ways I do it is through here. And so we talk about community cultural wealth and things like that. And there's ways you can like kind of weave it into your classroom. And so let's talk about that. So for instance, like let's start with familial capital. So I tell my students like or we'll start with aspiration. I'll just go that way. So I'll tell my students, what do you want to do after you graduate high school? Like, what is your goal? What is your career path that you want to take? And they tell me, oh, I want to do this and that, or I want to be a nurse or whatever, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Like, so well, how do you need to get there? Well, I know I need to go to college and I need to get into the nursing program and stuff like that. And they understand that part. Now a lot of that is like, maybe they're the TV like pop culture, things like that, or even their community is telling them about it, like their school or whatever. And so that's that aspirational capital. They're like they have this idea of like what they want, and they're like I hear students too, like, oh, my mom wants me to be a doctor, or my parents want me to be a lawyer or whatever, you know what I mean? And so those things are part of that aspirational capital, but then they also tie into familia when they talk about that. So familial capital can also be a part of that. So your family can have aspirational goals for you too, that they can push on you, right? And like sometimes they're like, no, I don't want to do that, and all this stuff. But the idea that they're supportive in that manner is familial capital. But then another example would be like, I'll tell my students, so do you have to go make dinner every night, or do you have to go and buy yourself dinner, and they're like, no, my mom makes me dinner, or my mom will make me lunch, or whatever. And that's an example of familial capital too. Being able to come home from school and then work or sports or whatever, and then your family having dinner ready for you, that's support. That's that familial capital. But then they can also provide you economically too with stuff like having a savings account for you and stuff like that. Like you hear about that too, like a college fund or whatever. But some people can't afford that, right? And so sometimes their parents working really hard and providing them with a home and food on the table and clothing and maybe a car with gas is that form of familial capital. That's that support, right? And so I teach that to my students too. And then another one is social capital. um and that's where we get knowledge from people within our social groups. And so family is kind of a social group too, so it's like those kind of like mixed together too. But usually it's like I tell my students, do you have any like older friends who are in college already? And they're like, yeah, like my primo is, or like my friend Tomas is in college now. And did they ever tell you guys about how to access or how to what it's like going to school? And yeah, they told me like, like it's don't do this whenever you're doing your first semester of school. Like, don't take chemistry with all these other hard classes. Social capital. And the thing that's beautiful about that too is like when they have those people that are like, yo, don't do that. And I do that with my students. I was like, your first semester, you need to take classes that you're gonna like adjust to. So like don't overload your schedule with all these tough classes. And so we talk about that too. So that's that idea of social capital. But the other thing is it's also navigational. So we're teaching them how to navigate that system, right? So maybe their primo Tomas is like, yo, when you apply for school, and you want to apply for these scholarships. So these are the scholarships that I applied for and got, and they helped me out to pay for my books and stuff like that. Same thing. So that social capital turns into navigational capital too. And then I already talked kind of about linguistic capital, so we can go into an environment where they're using language as a way to be able to navigate systems, right? So they can go to like a tutoring session that's bilingual, and when they're there, they get like a free book or something that helps them study for CAM or whatever, right? And so like there's all this different thing based off of that, right? Linguistic capital. But then we also have resistance capital, and that's advocating for themselves. And so I say, if your teacher gives you a grade that you weren't happy with, and you think you did better, what do you do about it? Well, I go talk to them, or I don't go talk to them. But some of them be like, yeah, I go talk to them, ask them why. I tell them that's an example of that. That's an example of resistance capital. You are taking the time to go ahead and try to figure out why this occurred. You're advocating for yourself. Same thing with college too. You can do the same thing, right? And so I tell them, get into the mode of doing those things because those are great forms of capital. And then I always bring quotes and stuff into this too, like going along with kind of several several different things, because there's like, and I think you guys are talking about this in class maybe too, is like there's like examples of like quotes and things like that that you use every day that are part of your community cultural wealth. And so mine would be this phrase. My dad would always say, like, if you're like, oh, I want to do this, but I don't know, like, what if they don't want to do that for me or whatever. And my dad would always say, all they can say is no. And so that applies at so many levels. So it's like this familial capital, social capital, and depending on what it is too, is like this idea of like resistance capital, navigational capital, because what they're doing, what he's just that one phrase, like all they can say is no. So like my dad's sharing that knowledge with me because he's like been through it, right? And then it's a form of social capital because it's this person that's part of my social group that's sharing this insight with me and this wealth with me. But it might be about something specific, like, oh, I don't know if I should um ask this professor if I can redo this assignment, or if I can have an extension, right? Well, my dad may have been the one to say, hey, why don't you ask your professor about this and see if maybe they can or your teacher about this to see if they can give you an extension, or maybe you can redo it, or whatever, right? You're kind of learning how to navigate the system, right? And then it's also resistance because now you're advocating for yourself after you like say, well, yeah, it's because it's true. All they can say is no. And so I go ask the professor, hey, is there any way I can get an extension on this because of this? Sure, I understand your plight. Awesome. I just advocated for myself. Resistance capital. All right. So there's like all these different forms and examples that we can use. But I always do this with my students. I'm going to share with you all, with your professor, a couple of documents. I'm giving you an example of how you can use this in the classroom, and it's like a comic strip um, activity where they make comics based on community cultural wealth of them as a group coming together and coming up with one. And then the other thing too is I'm sharing it's called the summary of cultural wealth with you all. And then you're also going to get I don't know if you guys are going to do this or not, but there's an activity that I always do after this, and this is like kind of setting it up for the activity, is where you guys do a community cultural wealth audit. Isn't that convenient? Like, audits like economic. So so we're doing a community cultural wealth audit. And you'll work on that after this, hopefully. And you get to audit your own community cultural wealth, giving examples of it. And are these like deficits or are they positive things for you too, right? And so you'll work on that. Let's move along a little bit. So here's some of those examples to community cultural wealth. I'm sharing this slideshow too with your professor if you guys want to review it or whatever. You're more than happy to, but it kind of breaks it down. And I know like the articles you've read and stuff like that give you the examples too. Um, but the idea is like to understand that like some of these intertwine with each other. And I want to get one thing straight too, is that like not all the time is it people that you would think would have and need cultural wealth. It's other individuals too. Like one example I always tell people about is like with my students in my community that I serve, a lot of their families are really involved in their lives, almost to a detriment to some of them. Are like, I wish they would just give me a break, right? And that's an interesting thing, but it's also a positive, right? To have somebody that's there for you and supportive of you and stuff like that. Well, I had one student, we were talking about this in here, and he was like, I don't have that. And this was a kid was a higher SES school, an affluent family. Both of his father was a physician, his mother was a lawyer. And he was like, yeah, I have all the monetary stuff, beautiful house, I have an awesome car, I have all the game systems I want and all this stuff, but my family's always gone. And so that was another part, and so we got to see like what he needed in regard to family. Some of my students could share with them, that did have it, and vice versa, right? And so they started like networking, right? And like saying like, well, yeah, you want to be, your parents want you to be a lawyer, and like, well, my mom's a lawyer and she could maybe hook you up with like an internship, or maybe you can go check out her law firm and stuff like that. And then vice versa, they're like, well, you should come to our house and come to our my cousin's quinceanera so you could see this stuff and stuff. So it's like all this stuff starts happening and they start networking, and it was really cool things, but it has to be pushed in order for that to happen, and we have to be introduced. Um, these are some other examples too. These are all on here. I kind of went over this. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. Um, So how about community cultural wealth? So think about these questions. Um, are there forms of cultural wealth that marginalized group possess that traditional thoughts of capital do not recognize, value, or cannot see? I gave you kind of a good example of that. I hope with like people speaking multiple languages. But think about those other things too. And I challenge you to kind of like talk about this with each other, maybe after this, after you guys watch this. Um, like what are those forms of capital that people don't see and value? Like think about those things. I gave you another example with like family. Like sometimes it's that. How might one find a community how might one finds a community's cultural wealth? Um, that's a good question. Like, how do we find those things? Like, where do we look? Um, think about that. And lastly, how does this play a role in your classroom and with your students? How can you use these things in your classroom? How can you know about this stuff? How can students having these skills and abilities lead to this and that? How can it help your classroom? How could contacts help your classroom? How could social capital within your classroom help other students? Like you are in a perfect position right now to do this because you guys just went through school. You guys went through your through higher ed. You guys have capital You guys have wealth that you can share with your students. You can be that social capital, that navigational capital. And so think about that. How can you do that? How are you going to do that in your classroom? Because all of our students need it. It doesn't matter like where you're at around the nation or world or whatever, our students need it. But how are you going to apply it? And you are in a perfect situation, especially for high school students who are about to transition into college. What wealth can you offer them? So think about that. All right. And I'm gonna kind of close with this. So why me? Why am I telling you about this? Why am I the one who's speaking to you about this? Yeah, you heard about that. I'm a PhD candidate. This is like one of my areas of expertise too. This is what my dissertation's about, all this stuff, right? But why me? Why is it important? Well, I'm one of those students that maybe you're going to have in your classroom. Okay. I grew up in a low income household, um, in less affluent, lower SES area of town. I grew up in the barrio or like the ghetto, what people say and shit, right? Sorry, I curse, but I do. I'm sorry. That's part of who I am. Um, so I grew up in those environments. I grew up speaking a different language. I grew up in an environment where there was drug problems and things like that. Schools were seen as undesirable and and things like that. And we didn't have a lot of resources at our schools. And we had high turnaround rates in our classroom with our teachers, things like that. And then on top of it too is like I was involved in gang activity. I was a gang member. Um, and did some pretty wild stuff at a young age. Like I got in trouble several times, like in middle school, you know what I mean, and stuff like that. Like even with the law and stuff. And so um, you know, thinking about those things, like those are things that our students face sometimes, right? And then I grew up in a Latino or Chicano family that was extended family too. So like my you know sometimes my aunt and my uncles lived with us with their three kids. And like I mean, like our house was full. My abuela lived with us. My abuela still lives with me and she's 99 years old. um and so that was part of my experience, and that's part of the experience of some of our students, or even they live in extended families and stuff like that too, or they have to deal with gang activity or drug abuse and things like that, or language, and living in a lower SES area, rural areas. I know some of y'all are from those areas too, or serving those communities, and low income students and stuff like that. Like I was one of those kids. Now maybe not all of your kids have all of these things, but some of them have some of that stuff. And that's why it's also important for me as an educator to share this information with you, and to discuss from my perspective, and what I've seen around me as an educator now and as a researcher and PhD candidate. Um, because that's what we face every day, and these are the things that we have to deal with as educators. And sometimes it's not all these things together, like it's like an onion, right? Like there's all these layers, but each one of those things brought me a different form of capital that I'll never forget and that I'll use my entire life. So hopefully you enjoyed this discussion. If you have questions, please feel free to contact me. I'm going to leave my contact information with your professor, and you'll be able to send me questions or whatever if you have comments or whatever. But please use those resources that I'm providing to you. Hopefully you enjoy your community cultural wealth audit, and you learn a little bit more about like what you have to offer. But if anything, make sure that you take advantage of the position you're in now as an educator who just went through higher ed, and you have some navigational capital and aspirational capital and social capital and resistance capital that you can share with your students. Thank you very much. It was nice talking to y'all. Gabino Noriega, out. Peace.